you very much for inviting me. It feels a real honor to be part of this meeting that you guys have put together. As Elisa said, it's something that we did in Australia. I think it's now more than 20 years ago. In fact, it is, because we had our 20th anniversary a couple of years ago in Sydney. And I have to say, we had a very nice cruise on the harbour there. So I recommend, if you guys last for 20 years, you should have a very nice celebration. But look, I can tell you that it's been really helpful for us. Every year we meet and come together as a group of scholars here. We call ourselves SOBER, as in Society of Organisational Behaviour in Australia. We don't necessarily behave in a very sober way. But every single year we have a discussion, should we only do this every 2 years? And every year we agree, no, we really want to do this every year, because over the years, it's really been an incredible source of support for each of us. And also, I think it's really helped us get competitive grants in Australia, because often, honestly, we end up reviewing each other's work, and we're obviously competing against scientists and so on for the small pot of money that exists. But, you know, I think most of all, it's really just created a fantastic support network and a lot of friendships, actually. So I congratulate you on setting this up, and I wish you all the very best. I think you'll hopefully, as I say, be celebrating in 20 years in the same way that we did. So look, today I'm going to talk about digital work and some of the research that we've been doing in this space. It's very early days for us. It's a small group, so I'm very happy if you want to unmute and ask a question at any point. Also, if we have time, I'm more than happy to take broader questions around publishing or any topic really that you want to raise. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hope that it all works out, and that we can see my slides. So if someone can just let me know when they come up, that would be terrific.
We can see your presentation.
Oh yes, so and actually I can actually see myself presenting, so that's very weird. Okay. So yes, as I say, jump in if you have any questions. So I'm going to just get started. So I mean, the first question, sort of just an introductory question, and a lot of discussion happening about this topic. What will work be like in the future? And if we characterize some extremes, on the one hand, there's this very dystopian perspective and I guess fear around what work might be like as we enhance the extent of artificial intelligence. And you can see there that Stephen Hawking, who, you know, is was a famous scientist in the UK, even he is quite pessimistic about what ultimately full artificial intelligence could look like. But even if your view is not as extreme as Stephen's there, you know, many times we see in the newspaper concerns about robots taking over jobs and mass unemployment and the need for basic income in the future, and these sorts of sort of worries, I guess. And then, of course, we have the other side of the coin where people believe that the future of work is going to be very utopian. And, you know, people speculate we might have this amazing leisure society where we all, you know, go to work a few hours a week and then just have a lovely leisurely life. Doesn't seem much evidence of that so far, I have to say. But, you know, and here's a quote from someone talking about a Maasai warrior with a cell phone now has got more access to information than the president of the USA did 25 years ago. And if he's on a phone with access to Google, you know, then even got more impressive access to information. So two very contrasting perspectives about the future of work. And of course, ultimately, we would imagine that the future might be somewhere in between those two extremes. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the conversation and worry about jobs being eradicated and replaced has been really strongly critiqued. And people talk about, the reality is not so much that whole jobs are going to be replaced by automation and algorithms and so on, but rather tasks within jobs will be replaced. And so people talk about 30% of tasks in 60% of jobs being automated in the future. And what that means, of course, is if tasks are increasingly being automated or carried out by algorithms or so on, then really it becomes a question of work design, because it becomes a question of, you know, who does what tasks and how do we organize those tasks, and how do robots and so on work together with humans in a team and so on. And so that fact is really one of the things we want to argue, and really the point of my presentation today will be to suggest that the future, whether it's utopian or dystopian, partly will depend on the choices that we make about work design. And work design is about the content and organizing of tasks, activities, relationships, responsibilities within a role or job. And often when we talk about the topic of work design, we talk about particular work characteristics. And these are aspects of work that have got sort of psychological significance. And I'll just share with you, some of you will have seen this already, but the model that we've created called the Smart Work Design Model. And this is where we've really sort of said, well, look, there's actually many different work characteristics. In fact, there's probably more than 30. But is there some way of synthesizing these so that we can make a little bit more sense of all of this, and not necessarily have to measure 30 work characteristics every time we want to understand work design? And so Caroline Knight and myself actually just been working on a paper where we've done higher order factor analysis and other things. In fact, we are submitting it. We have a revise and resubmit from the Journal of Organizational Behavior, and it's due tomorrow. So I will be getting up early tomorrow morning to hit the final submit button. We've just about got it ready to send back. And what we've done is, as I say, we've done a higher order factor analysis. And from that factor analysis, we identified 5 sort of higher order categories of work design. The first one being stimulating. And I'm going to talk through each of these in a bit more detail, so I won't dwell on them too much here. But stimulating, as you can see there, captures things like task variety, skill use, task significance. And it's really fundamentally about, are people's jobs designed in a stimulating way? The second one we call, yes?
So, Sharon,
Sorry?
what do you mean with information processing?
Oh, there's a measure, information processing requirements, I guess it is actually. So it's sort of like a measure of mental complexity. I don't know if you're familiar with the measure that's problem solving demands. There's one called problem solving demands and there's one called information processing demands. And they're both, it's just like how much information do you have to process in your work. So it's sort of like a measure of mental complexity, I guess.
It's more aligned with skill use than
yes.
task variety than significance meaning.
Yes. Actually, yes. Sometimes a task significance is a slightly tricky one. Sometimes it fits in stimulating and sometimes it fits in relational. So that one wasn't because actually, yeah, actually and in fact, I need to change these slides, but in our paper, actually we have it in relational. So I should change that really.
Cool.
The next one is mastery. And really this is about the fact that if you want to do well and master your work, you need to know what it is you're doing. So you need to have role clarity. Then you need to get feedback, of course, on your work. And it actually can help if you do that whole job. So you've got task identity and you understand where your job fits in the bigger picture of things. So that's M. A is actually agency, effectively job autonomy. And of course, there's different forms of autonomy in people's work. R is for relational. And this really is about all those more social and relational aspects of work that are really important, like having social contact, connecting with the end user. So this is Adam Grant's research on the motivational impact of, if you connect with the customer or the client and you learn what difference your work makes to those people. Social support from your supervisor, from your peers, and being part of a team. So these are all sort of relational aspects of work that make work more enriching. And then T is, I guess, one of the big ones in the sense of we're really talking about here the demands that people can face in their work, such as workload or pressure or work hours. And we use the word T to indicate that those demands need to be tolerable. So they need to be not too excessive. In the paper that we've prepared, the paper is a more academic paper. We don't use the SMART acronym in the paper, but when we work with organizations practically, we use this acronym of SMART, and we found that that's actually been very helpful to organizations because, as you know, there's a lot of interest in psychosocial risks and hazards. We actually map this model on to the main psychosocial risks in the workplace. And we just find that organizations really like the idea of, instead of focusing on risks and removing risks, focusing on creating good work. And then they like the idea of this very simple acronym, which covers most of the key aspects of work. So hopefully we'll get this paper accepted, and then we'll be able to have it cited a bit more widely from an academic perspective. Just to unpack that little acronym a bit more, here we have some hospital supply workers, and you can see they're talking about how they like variety and they like change. That's part of the stimulation. They talk about mastery, so they talk about the job teaches me a lot. They talk about agency, they influence things. They talk about relational, I'm proud of my job, it helps the patients who come to the hospital, and we get to know the nurses and be appreciated by them. And finally, they do talk about actually how sometimes the demands are perhaps getting less tolerable as things have got bigger, harder in that hospital. So that's the sort of practical version of an academic paper. We have applied that model in a few papers already. For example, just to give an example of how this works in a practical sense, we have been working with geneticists and other medical people to help understand how they can more effectively diagnose rare diseases. So this is a scenario where patients go on what's called a diagnostic odyssey. In other words, some people who have a rare disease, they can take up to 20 years to figure out what that disease is, because they're so rare. And actually, there's a huge cost to healthcare of people with these rare diseases because they disproportionately use the health system much more than other people. And one of the things that the group that we were studying did was they introduced these expert panel meetings, effectively a sort of form of teamwork. They brought in some technology, this thing called the patient archive, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And they brought in a nurse coordinator, and then we evaluated what effect this change in work design had. And in a sense, we argue it was a work design that made work smarter. It brought together a whole group of different disciplinary experts into these panel meetings, which made the work much more stimulating for people. It increased feedback because typically a specialist would see a rare disease patient once and then not see them for months. And this was a way of bringing together a lot of people and getting a lot more feedback about the patient and their process. Most importantly, this was really a relational intervention because it brought together a group of people that previously worked in isolation and didn't really have any opportunity to share their problems. And finally, there was a little bit of administrative support, so that improved their demands. And what happened is that within 1 year, they doubled the number of diagnoses. So they went from a diagnosis rate of about 30% to 55%, which is a huge cost saving for the health sector, and lots of benefits for family and staff. But from our perspective, of course, we were interested in what was the impact on the staff, the people involved in this intervention. And you can see some quotes there, you know, after every discussion, after every admission, I think the clinicians go home happy. They've discussed everything. There's nothing more that they can discuss. So really improving their sense, I guess, of making a difference, and so on. So that's an example of how that smart work design model works. And just to say, there's lots of research on work design. You've got Fred Morgeson coming. He's been one of the people that's also done a lot of work that shows that if you've got this sort of well-designed work, it's good from a mental health perspective, it's good from a motivation perspective, and of course the performance perspective. But also we just published a paper recently on the learning consequences of good work design as well. I did just want to, I'm going to talk about the digital agenda in just a minute, but because we literally this week just had this paper accepted, I did just want to share with you some new research in work design that is coming out. And this was actually some, you can see there, led by some colleagues in China that I'm collaborating with. And it's a study that focuses on what they call temporal aspects of work design. And what these guys noticed, they actually were working in a garment manufacturing company, and they noticed that there was a difference between the sewing machine people. You can see some people there who are just sewing. And then there were other people who were sort of like maintenance engineers who fixed the machines when they broke down. So they had to sort of wait around for a breakdown. And what the researchers observed was that the people that were just sort of waiting around for these unpredictable events, the machines to break down, actually were very dissatisfied with their work, and the turnover was much higher and so on. And so they theorized that this idea of temporal predictability, if you can predict when things are going to happen, actually time goes faster, and then you are more motivated and you perform more effectively. And the best metaphor for that actually is apparently when lifts were first introduced, people were very dissatisfied because you didn't know when the lift was going to stop, right? If you go up in the lift, you don't exactly know when it's going to stop. But they found when you put mirrors in the lift, people's sense of time went much faster because they had something to do, right? They could look at themselves in the mirror. And it's this same idea. If you're just waiting around for something uncertain to happen and you don't know when, like that, I don't know if you know that saying about a watched pot never boils. When you're waiting for the kettle to boil, when you're making a cup of tea, it seems like it's taking forever. If you know exactly when it's going to boil, then the time seems to go faster. So these guys observe this phenomenon, and they also observe that if you can chunk your work up into lots of little chunks, then time seems to go faster and you perform more effectively. And I guess Elisa mentioned that many of you are interested in publishing in the top tier journals. So I did just want to share with you what it took to get this study into AMJ, because it was a bit of a tough one. So in fact, there were 5 different studies that constituted this paper. There were 2 experiments. And so there were experiments where we manipulated those 2 aspects of temporal work design and showed the impact on performance. And of course, that had the advantage of strong focus on causality, but isn't a real world situation. We also had the study in the garment factory that I mentioned. So just looking at those 2 groups of workers and comparing their temporal work design. Then we had another field study where we looked at knowledge workers, and we modeled the relationship between these temporal work characteristics and experience of time, and then supervisor rated performance. And then you might think that's enough, but no, then the reviewers wanted us to control for all the existing work characteristics and all the existing mediators, and show that these effects still worked even when we did that. And that was the final study. So I thought I'd just share that with you because it's hot off the press. I think it's really exciting new avenue of research, but it also shows, you know, how tough sometimes it can be to get these tier 1 articles. But what I want to do now is I want to return back to the SMART model, and I want to talk about it in the context of future work. So if we take stimulating, and remember, this is about work being interesting and varied and mentally complex. What's it going to be like in the future? Well, one idea is that automation will replace the dull, dirty, dangerous tasks. And the idea is that the automation will replace those more routine tasks, leaving the more complex work. And certainly that happens in some instances. So you can see there's a citation to some work that I'm doing with colleagues in Lithuania, where we actually look at robots in manufacturing organization, and we show that the work gets more complex as a result of the automation. But it's also the case that introducing digital technology can also make work less stimulating. So one of the things that can happen is that your job can effectively become a monitoring job, where basically you're watching the automation, waiting for it to break down. And that can be a very boring job. Another example would be things like online piecework. So if you think about MTurk, you know, those people that we get to do our surveys and things every now and again, you know, that can be, it's micro work. Big tasks are broken into tiny little tasks and then assigned to gig workers. And that micro work can again be incredibly boring and tedious. So I just want to give an example of that. And this is a study by Sergieva et al. In 2019. And they were investigating the impact of introducing this type of robotic surgery that you can see in this picture here. And what you can see there is the nurse, the scrub nurse, and the scrub nurses are those people here that you can see standing around the table. They really talked about how their job became much less stimulating when this technology was introduced. They said we were only allowed to make the instrument tables ready and then at the end clean up the whole mess. We didn't really have a role. In other words, the the robotic surgery was introduced, and the consequence was much less stimulating work for the nurses in the team. Just to give another example, we've been doing some research here in Australia where they have automated the trains. And so instead of the train drivers actually driving the trains, in this scenario, what the train drivers do is they basically wait for the trains to break down. They do break down, but not very often. They only break down about 5% of the time. And when they break down, these train drivers go and rescue them. This is sort of out in the desert in the Australian mining sector. But there's been a huge impact on the quality of work. In a sense, you can see there loss of identity and prestige, people, much more boring jobs, less time thinking on their feet and less time thinking out the box. They do other things like they polish the trains, but they don't feel like that has much purpose. The jobs they report have a lot less variety and a sense that they are losing their skill. And just to share a quote with you, with a Band-Aid. So Band-Aid's like a plaster, I'm not sure what you call it, but with a Band-Aid until the techies get there to fix things up. Originally, train drivers were up there with airline pilots. They were one of those careers everyone aspired to. Now we're just forgotten with the Band-Aids. So a huge change in the extent to which the work is stimulating as a result of this particular automation. So what about mastery? And remember, mastery is about being clear about what it is that you're meant to be doing and getting feedback and so on your performance. And once again, there can be real positives from digitalization, because you've got the opportunity for the devolution of knowledge. You've got things like big data and sensors and all sorts of things that actually could increase your learning and your mastery. But again, we also have this potential for digital technology to actually result in skill loss and impaired learning. And probably one of the best examples of that is actually in aviation, where pilots talk about forgetting how to fly, for example, because they don't actually get much opportunity to. And just to give another example from robotic surgery, and this is a study by Bean et al., one of the things that happened that Bean observed was that the new surgeons, so the trainee surgeons, the residents, under this new way of doing surgery, had many fewer opportunities to learn how to do the role. If you think about how surgeons traditionally learn, you'll have the senior surgeons will sort of do some set the operation up, and then the residents will come in and sort of finish it off, and they'll call the senior person in if they need a bit of help. But under the new model, you can see that the senior surgeon is sitting over here controlling everything with very little opportunity for the resident to get stuck in and have a go. In a sense, they talk about this idea that they had very peripheral participation. And another problem was that because everything is magnified on these screens, you can see the screens there in the picture, then it means that any mistake, if the resident does have a go at trying to do the robotic surgery, it's magnified up onto this screen, and any small error is sort of accentuated, which also, of course, can make it more difficult to learn. And ultimately, the consequence was that the chair of urology in this particular case said, well, look, they trained in the top programs that teach robotic surgery, and they suck. I mean, these guys can't do it. They haven't any experience doing it. They watched it happen. Watching a movie doesn't make you an actor. You know what I'm saying. So here is an example of how into the future, some of these technologies may actually reduce the opportunity for feedback and trying things out and getting that mastery. What about autonomy? Once again, because information is devolved and there's more information flowing, there's great potential for more autonomy into the digital future. But of course, you would all be familiar with some of the risks around algorithms and other sorts of systems replacing human judgment and ultimately taking away the opportunity for humans to make decisions. And one of the big problems of this, I mean, there's been a lot now written about algorithms making decisions and, for example, the bias that can emerge. But one of the problems, of course, is these algorithms are based on historical data, and they're not very good when the situation changes because they're only based on historical data. And there's a very nice book, if anyone is interested, on how the use of algorithms actually contributed to some of the financial disasters of the past, because they are based on historical data and they're not very good when the situation changes. And increasingly we're seeing these examples of machines making decisions instead of humans, with sometimes quite disastrous consequences. Another thing that we're also seeing, and I just alert you to a paper that a colleague, Xavier Perrin-Rochelot, and myself published recently on algorithms as work designers. And one of the things that's happening, of course, is that increasingly algorithms are taking over some of the functions of management, and this is called algorithmic management. And Uber drivers are a classic example. If you think about who assigns the task, who assigns the rides, it's an algorithm, it's not a human. If there's a problem and you want to complain, it's not a human you complain to. It's an algorithm. So we actually did a review recently of algorithmic management and what impact it's having on work. And I'll share some of those findings with you later. But basically, it can really reduce the autonomy that humans have over the work. What about relational? What about those team aspects into the future? Well, once again, technology can really augment human skill. And this concept of centaur teams, which is the idea that a machine and a human together are far more powerful than either a team of humans or a team of machines. And that's actually been shown in the context of playing chess, where, a basic computer and a half decent chess player can beat, a sort of champion chess player, or they can beat, the world's biggest computer, because of the value that comes from humans and machines working together. But of course, we also, again, have risks. One of the things that can happen is that when people work with robots in teams, they can just not trust them enough, which means you don't make use of the machines sufficiently. Or the other side of the coin is you trust the machines too much. And actually this creates complacency. And then something actually goes wrong, or the machine does something dumb, and it creates this thing called an automation surprise. And so those are some of the risks that can emerge from a team perspective. And another one we found with our algorithmic management review, one of the problems with Uber drivers and things like this is when they have got a problem or they need support, they actually don't have a manager that they can get help from. So it can be quite isolating in that respect. And if I just go to the last component of the model, which is T for tolerable, and this is about having demands in your work that are reasonable. Well, of course, on the one hand, digitalization should reduce demands. We're meant to be getting closer to that leisure society, right? Because that's the point of technology. It's meant to save labor and make things easier. But we all know the reality is probably that things are going in the other direction. And actually, there's lots and lots of examples of when digitalization is introduced, that actually things become more intense and the demands are greater. And probably one of the best examples of this are the Amazon fulfillment centers. So these are the warehouses of Amazon, and all around the world, in Melbourne, even in Germany, in European countries, in the US, there have been a huge number of issues with Amazon fulfillment workers, where basically people say, you're either treated like a robot or you're replaced by one. And basically they have a very strong focus on surveillance, and they monitor people's movements and control their time to the nth degree, so that people end up, barely being able to, go to the bathroom if they need to, because everything is so tightly monitored. And again, that was a bit of a theme that we found in our algorithmic management review, that most of the time when algorithmic management is introduced, it makes work more intense, more demanding, rather than less. So I suggested before, there's lots of research that smart work design has got lots of benefits from a mental health, motivation, learning perspective. And then what I'm saying, well, what's the impact of digital technologies on smart work design? Well, it really depends. It can be good, it can be bad. It really depends. And of course, whenever we say it depends, it means there's some sort of moderators in process. And what we are suggesting is that what we need to be doing is influencing this relationship. In other words, we need to be having more human-centered design of technology and implementation of technology with actual proactive attention to work design. Because what we observe is most of the time the technology is implemented, and then later there's like, oh, that actually is made, like for example, with the automated train case where we've been doing some work, the technology is implemented, and then suddenly they discover there's 500 train drivers who are really demoralized and disengaged because the work is so terrible. We need to actually be thinking about work design before the technology is actually implemented. So I just want to go back to that example I said before, where the nurse's role had become very boring, and they were getting really frustrated. Well, so an incident occurred in this particular case where a resident sort of got a bit stuck and asked the nurse to help actually move the little arms, the trocars they're called. And that happened, and it turned out the nurse was very good at doing it. And so then they realized they could actually create a role where the nurses could actually, in a sense, help do the surgery. And as a consequence, the nurse's role really significantly improved, in fact, became almost better than pre-automation, because they were actually allowed to sort of help with the surgery itself. But the point is that this was really an accident. This only happened through luck. And what we're suggesting is that, yeah, let's not leave it to luck. Let's actually proactively think about creating smart work when those technologies are being introduced. Let's also try to shift the conversation away from replacing human workers to think about augmenting human work. In other words, and I guess it's very dominant amongst engineers and the people who design technology to be very focused on how many jobs can we eradicate to save money. But we really need to shift away from that mindset to be saying, well, how can technology be used to make human work better, not just to replace human workers? And I mentioned before the rare diseases situation where we observed a really big improvement in diagnosing these rare cases. And one of the things that they introduced was this thing called Patient Archive, which is this sort of technology which collates all the data from all around the world, and then they use that technology to help with the diagnosis. But the really important thing is that the geneticists that ran this system talked about the patient archive is just one opinion out of many. So it wasn't that this patient archive was being used to replace the decision-making of the other medical experts, or even to say that the patient archive was better than those, but the patient archive was one voice to be considered, but not the person actually, not the thing making the decision. And that's really important approach. We've done another study. I won't go into too much detail here, but we did a study where we created a little scenario. You can see this is the sort of thing that we gave the people to participate in. A little scenario where, imagine you're a customer service officer at a hotel, and, we've introduced this technology called Smart Answer. And it's going to suggest how you should respond when a customer complains or writes to you. And then we created two conditions. We created a condition where we said to people, look, this Smart Answer, is usually the best. So your management team advises against deviating from the Smart Answer. And then in an alternative condition, we said, the Smart Answer is going to make a recommendation, but you can always use your judgment and your personal initiative. And then, of course, we looked at these two different conditions, and we investigated whether people were willing to make more ethical or make less unethical decisions when they had some more autonomy over the situation. So you can see there, this is a case where the customer is writing and saying, I used my loyalty points and it was meant to only cost $160, but hey, I was charged $300. Can you sort of sort this out? And then you can see that little star there is the Smart Answer, which is the algorithm is recommending to the customer service agent, well, to choose this answer. Your booking total came to $300, so you have to pay it. If your points did not provide the discount but have disappeared, we cannot provide you with a refund. Well, this is a pretty, mean thing, really. And what you would hope in this scenario is that if the algorithm was suggesting this, you would hope that the human customer service operator would actually say, no, I'm going to choose this one. I'm going to choose the other one. And we actually did this with lots of different scenarios. And we found that if people really were in this low autonomy condition, they were actually much more likely to accept this unethical response as being okay. In other words, if we're implementing AI, we need to be reminding people that you can still use your judgment and you can still use your choice. If we want people to make ethical decisions, if we don't do that, then people are going to probably just accept these, be compliant with these dumb decisions that the machine is making. So I think what we also need to do is we don't just need to think about influencing technologies when they are implemented. We also need to think about the design of the technologies. So we actually need to design the technologies in a way that is human-centered, because sometimes choices are made in the design of the technology that then make it actually very hard to give people smart work. And an example of this is Elon Musk, who's actually famous for trying to create a factory which was completely automated. And then he actually discovered what a dumb idea that was, and he actually concluded that humans are underrated and realized that Tesla had gone too far in trying to eradicate humans altogether. And so, realized that they needed to design the technology in another way. And again, just to give an example from our own research, we've been working with the Australian Navy with the design of their future submarines, and trying to influence the way that the technology is designed in those submarines, because it's got really big implications for the fatigue of the workers and those sorts of things. So that's another part of the strategy. So that's really, we're suggesting those two things. Think about creating better work when you implement the technology, but also think about creating better technology as well. And that really means educating managers, designers, and others about work design. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm happy to take questions on this. But we have done some studies to look at how people design work. And I'm just going to skip over that because it's getting a bit late. But what we basically found is that most people are inclined to design bad work. In other words, a lot of people don't understand what it is that is good from a work perspective. And so they tend to design quite repetitive jobs because they think they're more efficient. And I'll just skip over that as well. So just to mention, I said before we did this review on algorithmic management, what we found is that most of the studies, I think we found around 40 studies, the outcomes for work design when companies introduce algorithmic management are mostly negative, with algorithmic management tending to result in lower job resources, so lower autonomy in particular, but also to increase job demands. And we actually suggested that, with algorithmic management, the sorts of things that we need to be doing is increasing the transparency so that people understand when, like, for example, Uber drivers understand exactly what is it that makes up their performance ratings, and how are rides allocated, because a lot of the time people don't understand, and that's quite stressful because then they don't know, well, if I knock off early, am I going to be penalized and then not being given good rides because I've knocked off early, and so on. And we need to increase the fairness and, most importantly, increase that opportunity for human influence rather than just letting the machines decide everything. So, and hand in hand with this, I think there's lots of really interesting and important research questions that we should be asking. For example, one of the things that's happening, of course, is that machines are increasingly themselves becoming autonomous agents. So we've got autonomous cars, and this is happening more and more. So what happens from an accountability perspective if machines are autonomous? Who should be accountable? Because traditionally we would argue that you can only be accountable for something if you're in control of it. So how can humans maintain control in the light of AI? Can work design help to maintain human skills and learning when AI is introduced? How can work design prevent bias from AI? We need to give more attention to what we call socio-technical systems approaches, which is when you're really thinking about human and technical issues together. And we also, I think, ultimately need different sorts of research to investigate some of these questions. We need more close studies, more qualitative studies, more interventions, and most important, I think we actually need more interdisciplinary research in this space. So just to quickly summarize, work can be more or less smart. So I sort of introduced that new model, and that affects worker health and productivity. Technology can make work less smart or more smart, depending on the technology and how it's used and implemented. So what we need to do is more proactively consider how work design might be affected by technology. And managers and change agents need to take steps to maximize smart work design when they're introducing new technology. And we need to think about the design and the commissioning of technology to make sure it's got the right sorts of affordances built into it. And ultimately, there's really a lot more need for research in this area. So I said at the beginning, what sort of future might we have? Are we going to have a future which is like this geneticist who talks about a patient archive as really helping human work, not just replacing it? Or are we going to have the hellish workday of an Amazon warehouse where technology is just used actually to control people more tightly than ever? And I think that ultimately, I love this quote by John Shah. It's one of my favorite quotes. The future is not someplace we are going to, but one we are creating. The paths are not to be found, but made. And the idea here is that the sort of choices, the paths that we should be making, I think, are these active human-centered choices and human-centered design to create better work so that we can really harness the benefits of technology. I do just want to mention that I'm an editor for a special issue coming up on some of these topics, the human side of the future of work, for the Academy of Management Discoveries, which is a relatively new Academy of Management journal. But you go onto their website, you can see details about this special issue. I think the papers are not due until mid next year, so there's plenty of time. But do check that out. I think it could be a really great issue to be involved in. And I think that's really it from me. So just love to say thank you so much for inviting me again today. Do connect with me on LinkedIn. I try to put my papers up there and so on and keep that fairly up to date. But I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So I will stop sharing and open up the questions. Thank you.
Questions, Gonzalo? No?
Can you hear me, Sharon?
Yes, I can hear you. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. A couple of questions. The first one, to what extent are personal preferences related to the smart dimensions? I mean, are there dimensions that are more attractive for some people, some that can be, not even relevant for some people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yep. Shall I answer that one first, and then you can ask me the second one? Yeah. So, well, look, yeah, there's in work design theory, there's a sort of long history of recognizing that individual differences, which is what you're really talking about, do make a difference. So, you know, the old-fashioned Hackman and Oldman theory talked about growth needs strength, which is this idea that some people really want to grow and so on. But I mean, it's interesting. The evidence about that is a bit mixed, actually, and there's fairly good evidence that yes, these things are influenced by individual differences, but ultimately there are main effects for most of these variables. In other words, they pretty much work for everybody, but you know, the strength of the effect perhaps varies. So, you know, if you think about relational work, you know, some people need more support and interaction than others. And so, of course, if you're a really extroverted social person, that's going to be more important to you. But even if you're an introverted person, it's still important to connect with other people. And in fact, we discovered that during COVID, right? You know, that, and in fact, I've got a quote from one of our studies, which is somebody saying, you know, I thought I was an introvert and I didn't really need people, but I've discovered how much I do. So I would say, yes, individual differences shape the strength of these pathways, but actually, most of those SMART dimensions are important for everyone, but just to different degrees, I think. And that's because, by the way, and we talk about this in the paper, I didn't really talk about it here. That's because those aspects, those SMART aspects, they very much relate to the core psychological needs that people have. So, you know, self-determination theory talks about the need for relatedness. Well, that's the relational part. The need for autonomy, that's the agency part. The need for competence, that's the mastery and the stimulating part. So ultimately, that's why I think that they do work for most people, is because they actually connect into those fundamental human needs that Dici and Ryan argue that everybody has. And I think you had a second question.
Yes, thank you. The other one was regarding the automations of decisions, at least in the field of selection and assessment. I guess that academics has been pushing their agenda towards eliminating human judgment from selection decisions, because we're very bad at making those decisions and we have a lot of bias when doing that. But you seem to be recommending to go in a different direction. I wonder, what's your reaction or your position on that?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because people often think that decisions are going to be more objective because machines make them. But the machines make those decisions on the basis of data, which may be very biased. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that this is happening. So for example, just to give a concrete example, Google discovered that it was using algorithms to send high-paying jobs. So, you know, really high-paying jobs to people to say, apply for this job. And it was using algorithms to do that. Those jobs got sent mostly to men, because historically men have had the high paying jobs. So what actually automation can increase the bias, actually, because it does it in a very fast and efficient way. There's also many other examples. For example, another one would be there's evidence that decisions around parole and things like that in courts, they found that, again, they use historical data to set the parole, and they found that it was discriminating against Black people because they historically were more likely to break parole and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of examples of actually machines accentuating and making worse bias. So it's not to say that machines can't be objective. They can, but they also, all machines are rules, and all they use is the rules are based on data, and the data can be flawed, is the point. So yeah, so I'm not, so we would need to be careful with recruitment and selection that we don't actually perpetuate and in fact accelerate bias that already exists. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
We have another question from Lorena. Raise the hand first, please.
Yes, hello.
Hello,
colleague. Hola, colegas.
Hello, Lorena. Hola.
Well, very stimulating your talk. And I have a couple of one question and one comment, and I would like your impressions. And at some point in my life, earlier in my training, I also participated in the design of submarines in an ergonomics company during my graduate school in the US. And always the tricky question for the people was like, where can we get proper interview protocols to assess what experts are doing? So I guess my question for you is, where could we get, or I could get protocols for digital jobs if I would like to do work assessing the characteristics of people doing this type of occupations? Maybe you can point us to some sources of interview protocols. It's always like what to ask. And the second issue is something that I find very preoccupying. And listening to your conversation, you talk about smart jobs. Smart always points to us to IQ. And the future of work, everything is pointing to jobs are going to be people with higher IQ are going to have a better future. And I guess my preoccupation here is, what do we do with dumb work, with people with low IQ? And I think that's and maybe you can help us here. That points to us to the issue of differential validity, how so much knowledge from the ancient and indigenous communities is lost. I come from Mexico. We have people doing some art crafts that are just beautiful, amazing, and that knowledge is being lost because people don't buy them, the violence, whatever, and these people may end up doing very, very dumb work in factories, and that dexterity, that IQ that they have doing things that are manual, it's sometimes totally lost. So I would like your impressions on that. And I think that maybe that points to your assessment of we have to come up with different ideas and different methods of assessing people's ability so they can do something smarter with their own type of smart.
Yeah, that's such a great bundle of questions. If I take the second comment first about smart work. By smart work, I guess I do mean stimulating mastery, agentic, relational, and tolerable. I don't necessarily mean smart from an IQ perspective. I guess that's the first thing to say. My view is that all work can be smart at any. So, for example, I think we sometimes assume that good work design is the province of lawyers and doctors and surgeons, and actually you can have really well-designed work as a hairdresser, in fact, one of the things we did to try and communicate work design in our center was we did sketches of people doing work. And one of the sketches I like to share is of Jeremy, who rated his job 9 out of 10. He loved his job, and he's a rubbish tip manager. Why did he love his job? Because he had autonomy. He could make his own decisions. Because he had autonomy, he recycled all the waste to make things. So he made his work very stimulating. People dropped by because it was a rubbish tip to drop off their rubbish. So he got a lot of social connection. The demands were quite manageable for him. So it's a so-called dirty job. I mean, people talk about dirty work. And yet it was a really, and it's not a job we think of as an intellectually, tough job, but it was work that he found that was smart. It was stimulating to him. He knew what he was meant to do. He was clear about it. He had autonomy. He had connection with other people. So it was we would say that's a well-designed job. So smart work can apply to all sorts of work. And in fact, a lot of the worst work design examples that I see are lawyers and doctors. They have some of the worst work designs. Lawyers often have to record what they do every 9 minutes. every 9 minutes of activity, they have to record what they're doing because that gets to get charged to a client. So that is a pretty miserable way to live your life, frankly, accounting for every 9 minutes of your, not all law work is like that, but some is. Burnout is huge amongst lawyers. So I think the first thing is just to be clear that smart work isn't the luxury of just professional and educated jobs. And related to that, what people see as stimulating, you know, it is your judgment of what is stimulating. We, for example, have people who are intellectually disabled who come into our workplace, and they clean up, they make sure the milk's stopped, and they clean up the office. And look, that is not work that you or I would find stimulating, but they find it stimulating. They find it rewarding. So I think that if we look at work design through this smart lens, it's really about creating meaningful work for the individuals within it. And that goes to your point about, you know, if all the sort of work that we create is in factories and with machines controlling people, yeah, then we're probably on the road to dumb work. And my point is, let's try to remember that humans are what this is all about, and let's try to create jobs that meet those human needs. And that's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. So, and then your second question about the interview protocols, I'm not quite sure I know exactly what you mean. Maybe that's something we could talk about offline. But I think you were talking about what sort of interview questions might you ask someone to try to figure out how things might change. And actually, this is where it's quite hard. Like with the submarine project we talked about, you know, you almost have to do like future scenarios and then try to come up with different ideas for each, because no one really knows. Actually, it's very hard to design work that doesn't exist yet, I guess, is what I'm saying. And really all you can do is sort of say, well, under this scenario, this is what we do, and under this scenario, this is what we do, and try to shape those scenarios. But it's much harder if it doesn't exist. So we did find
we're having 3 minutes. We're having 3 minutes left. So, and we have one more question, Alvaro.
Okay.
Alvaro.
Thank you,
I have 3 minutes for you, Sharon. Thank you first for a great seminar. I got to know your smart model the last time you were in Chile at Adolfo Ibáñez, and I really got into it, and I use it a lot teaching in my classes, but I adapted it a little bit because you said
meaning. What you did. Yeah.
Meaning of work, you couldn't put it like in one of the smart aspect. I put it separately, and I called it partes in Spanish. So I put it separately. That's my first question. Does this make sense to you to have like meaning of work as a different dimension? You did the analysis, so does that make sense for you?
I guess by meaning of work, yes.
And purpose, meaning and purpose.
Yes, that's a good point. It didn't come out as separate in our analyses. It more just was a bit blurred. Sometimes it was really strongly in relational, but it overlapped a bit with stimulating. It didn't come out as a separate factor. But I'm really happy to hear that you're using it, and also that you've adapted it, because it's not like set in stone or anything. I mean, it's just, actually, to be honest, if I'm completely honest, we came up with it really from a more practical perspective. And then it was a bit of a sort of last minute decision of, why don't we actually try to publish this? So, you know, we did it a little bit backwards. But I will send you the paper that we are submitting, Alvaro, and you can have a look at what we did. And, you know, of course, it's fine to adapt these things. There could be cross-cultural differences as well. And also, you know, what you get in terms of the higher order structure always depends on what you put in. And, you know, if you put in different things, we might get something slightly different. And that's okay. I think all we're really trying to do is just sort of come up with a bit more of a broader perspective than, 30 different characteristics. So yeah, adaptation is always good.
Let me ask you my second question, because we have 1 minute left. And it's basically a favor, because I've been working with a professor in ethics on getting to the ethics of work design. And we don't have time to expand now, but you related to basic needs of SDP and everything. And we believe that there's like an ethics mandate for a good work design. And does that make sense to you to work with? Because we're starting on this line of research, and I wanted to know your opinion about it.
I guess if you mean that there's a sort of ethical imperative to design good work, is that what you're saying? Yeah. You know, that would be very similar. You know, in Europe, there's this thing called the decent work agenda. I think that would really overlap with that. And if you look at organizations like the International Labour Organization, they talk a lot about decent work. You know, we talk about good work and well-designed work. But I think you would find that that's got quite strong ethical overtones to that movement of decent work. So that might be something to check out. Just last comment, because I know we're about to run out of time. We've been looking at the role of work design in causing ethics. We've been looking at it from that angle. And I've got a colleague here, Anu, who I mentioned her research. So I'm happy to put you in touch if you're ever interested in the other way. How does work design shape ethics? But I think the idea of an ethical lens, because if you look at the ILO's, what are they called? The 22 grand goals. I've forgotten what they're called. You know, they talk about things like decent work as fundamental human rights, actually. Right. So yeah, great. It's
kind of an ethical basis, well, Aristotelian ethical basics of the work design. But if you may allow, I will get in touch with you to tell you more about it.
Great. Thank you.
I would definitely suggest that if you have some funds, try and arrange a visit, because it's a pretty nice place to understand.
Except we're not letting anyone into our state at the moment. Yeah. But when that opens up, we would love to welcome any of you.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Sharon, thank you very much, personally and as a society, and Hector also wants to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharon.
Thanks, Lisa.
This is an important event for us, and we are very grateful of your presence here. I just want to say that every industrial revolution introduced challenges on the skilling and agency maybe, but I think the main problem in the future will be relational, right? Because in terms of the technology, virtuality, and so on. So I think the Transformative Work Design Center will provide a very, very good contribution to that. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for having me. And I hope you enjoy and have a wonderful conference. And look forward to meeting you all.
Your contribution too, because this is also something where you planted a little seed, you know? So
great.
thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Great to see it growing. Bye, everyone.